Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
All insurance plans are required to cover preventive care at no cost.
I mean, where's the oppression coming from here? Who's trying to use the law to impose morality on people? It ain't the Catholic Church, it's the secular state.
Churches, houses of worship are exempted from this policy.
And I find it totally offensive that we are subject to accommodations and grandfather clauses. You can't accommodate and you can't grandfather clause the First Amendment.
Today, the issue of religious liberty captures more headlines than ever. Tension is growing.
In Virginia's Ten Commandments controversy, a high school has changed the display of the religious document.
A new development in that controversy over prayer during the graduation service at Medina Valley High School in Castroville.
Will we be able to live according to our faith and conscience?
Can the federal government step into a religious institution and redefine their doctrine for them?
I don't think that a bunch of guys, a bunch of men on this committee should be making the decision as to whether contraception is available.
It gives a feeling to those of us who aren't of a particular religion that we're not as important and we don't really matter.
The freedom of religion, it is the bedrock upon which this nation was founded. If we lose it, we lose America.
Intersections. Can you imagine what an intersection would look like if there were no signs or signals to keep traffic flowing safely? It's the same for the intersection of church and state. With the signs and signals of the First Amendment in place, the traffic flows safely. When they're ignored, collisions occur. Today, there are a lot of collisions. Hi, I'm Gregory Seltz. In this program, constitutional experts, a former senator, and church leaders will examine the intersection of church and state. Let's start where it all began, in Philadelphia. In this very room in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and on this very table, the Declaration of Independence was signed. That document declared that there are certain rights that are not within the power of the government to either grant or take away. In the Bill of Rights, the document which declared what those unalienable rights were, the first 16 words were about religion. George Washington said religion was an indispensable support of political prosperity. Religion is the first topic of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Religious freedom is the first right recognized by the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first clause has come to be called the Establishment Clause. It prohibits Congress from designating an official religion. The second clause has become known as the Free Exercise Clause. It says that Congress cannot make laws preventing people from practicing their faith according to their conscience.
First Amendment enshrines and protects 5 basic rights: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition your government. And I think one way to think of the First Amendment is to think of freedom of religion as the first of these mutually connected, mutually dependent rights. To exercise your religion, at least in the Christian tradition, there has to be this right of assembly for the corporate worship of believers. Freedom of speech for preaching, proselytizing, freedom of press for preparing, distributing the Word of God and other religious documents. And so I think we see these rights coming together, and they make sense if you think of them as being connected in this first and primary right of freedom of religion.
What do you think when you hear claims that people of faith are not to be active in the public square, or that the government should be secular, unmoved by religious sentiments at all, or claims that the federal government has the right to limit religious freedoms in certain instances?
I think it's good as a separation because you want to make sure that you don't let the politics and people's religious beliefs, kind of intersect. We have a diverse nation right now, so I think it's a good idea to keep them separate.
They should be separate because I think otherwise it doesn't blend good together because you have a conflict of interest a lot of times.
I'm a big believer in separation of church and state. I think that it's perfectly fine and even reasonable for people to be guided by their moral values. I don't particularly care where those moral values come from.
They're always saying that Christians need to be quiet. We're trying to hinder other people, but a lot of times they're trying to hinder us. And so when they talk about separation of church and state, I don't think they actually know what it means.
But doesn't the Constitution mandate that there should be a wall of separation between church and state?
When we talk about the wall of separation, I contend that it's more of a red herring than anything.
It's not a part of the Constitution itself, but it has widely been attributed as a characteristic of the First Amendment.
Surprisingly, the phrase wall of separation is actually not in the Constitution. So where did the expression wall of separation come from? In fact, the term came from Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, in a letter to a group of Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut.
And the Baptists celebrate Jefferson because they knew that when Jefferson was a leader in Virginia, he had championed the rights of religious minorities, including Baptists. And the Baptists in New England are struggling under the domination of the Congregationalist Church, which enjoys legal favors in New England.
So the Danbury Baptists write to Jefferson complaining about their situation. That religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as unalienable rights.
And it's in response to this letter that Jefferson writes back to the Danbury Baptists, again, expressing solidarity with them in their aspirations for religious liberty. But he also uses this language. He speaks of the First Amendment as having built a wall of separation between church and state. And it's through this letter that this metaphor of a wall of separation enters into American political vernacular.
Jefferson responded, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions," he continued quoting the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So it was Thomas Jefferson's way of describing the First Amendment of the Constitution to a group of Baptists in Connecticut that birthed the metaphor wall of separation.
I would suggest to you that Jefferson's use of the metaphor was essentially an affirmation of this principle of federalism, that matters of religion are to be left to religious societies, individuals, and to the extent necessary to state and local governments. And it's a matter that the federal government was to have no dealings with.
Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor was not mentioned in a Supreme Court case concerning the Establishment Clause until 1947, when Justice Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion in Everson versus Board of Education.
The court embraced that famous metaphor of Thomas Jefferson, the metaphor of a wall of separation, but they took it a step further. They said that the First Amendment had erected, in the court's words, a high and impregnable wall of separation. And then they concluded by saying we could not approve the slightest breach. And it is this rhetoric from the court, 1947, that has, I think, impacted so many policies, so many government actions today, limiting and restricting the place and role of religion and people of faith in public life.
Today, this metaphor has become the common expression of the way people understand the First Amendment's impact on how church and state relate. But does Jefferson's wall and Hugo Black's embellishment do a disservice to the First Amendment? Justice William Rehnquist thought so.
It is impossible to build sound constitutional doctrine upon mistaken understanding of constitutional history, but unfortunately, the Establishment Clause has been expressly freighted with Jefferson's misleading metaphor for nearly 40 years. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, in France at the time the constitutional amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were passed by Congress and ratified by the states. His letter to the Danbury Baptist Association was a short note of courtesy, written 14 years after the amendments were passed by Congress.
Considering his absence, Justice Rehnquist noted that Jefferson would be a less than ideal source of contemporary history as to the meaning of the religion clauses of the First Amendment.
But the problem is if we replace the language of the First Amendment with this wall of separation metaphor, a wall is a bilateral barrier. It not only inhibits things moving from one side to the other, but from the other side to the first side. And that changes fundamentally the restrictions of the First Amendment.
We could have called it a line in the sand, or a partition, or a short fence that I like to refer to as, where you can still cooperate, religion and government, but there has to be some degree of separation for each of them to maintain their own values.